In the summer of 1901, a woman named Cecelia Marsh stood at the altar of a white clapboard church in Caldwell County, Tennessee, and married a man named Thomas Aldridge in front of 63 witnesses. The ceremony lasted 20 minutes. The preacher was a man named Reverend Good who had known both families for 30 years. The flowers were white carnations because that was what was available in July in a town that size. Cecelia wore her mother's dress, taken in at the waist, and carried a small Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. By every visible measure, it was an ordinary wedding in an ordinary Tennessee town at the turn of an ordinary century. There was one detail that none of the 63 witnesses knew. The woman standing beside Thomas Aldridge at that altar was not Cecelia Marsh. Her name was Vera, and she was Cecilia's younger sister. That single substitution, one sister for another in front of a preacher and a congregation who had no reason to look closely enough to notice, set in motion a deception so complete and so carefully maintained that it would not fully unravel for 40 years. By the time it did, Vera Marsh had been living as Cecelia Aldridge for 4 decades. She had raised 3 children under that name. She had buried a husband under that name. She had attended church, kept house, joined the Ladies' Auxiliary, voted in 2 elections, and been known to everyone in Caldwell County as a woman she was not. And the real Cecelia Marsh, the woman whose name and life and husband had been quietly borrowed without her permission, had been living 30 miles away in a different county under a different name with full knowledge of exactly what her sister had done and exactly why. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what Caldwell County, Tennessee looked like in the summer of 1901, and what it meant to be a woman there at that particular moment in American history. The county sat in the middle part of the state, hill country that was neither the flat farmland of the west nor the serious mountains of the east, but something in between, rolling tobacco land cut through with creek hollows, small settlements built around churches and general stores, and the particular social hierarchies that form when people have lived in the same place for 3 or 4 generations and know each other's business the way you know a road you've driven 1,000 times. Everybody in Caldwell County knew who you were and who your people were and what your people had done and what your people owed. And that knowledge was not neutral. It was a form of currency and a form of constraint simultaneously. The Marsh family occupied a specific position in that social geography. Their father, Edmund Marsh, had been a tobacco farmer of moderate success who had died in 1897, leaving behind a wife named Augusta, 2 daughters, and a set of debts that were not ruinous but were not comfortable either. Augusta Marsh was a practical woman who understood the arithmetic of her situation clearly. In 1901, a woman in Caldwell County without a husband was not independent. She was precarious, and 2 unmarried daughters in a household with constrained finances were a problem that resolved itself only one way in that time and place: through marriage, and through marriage to the right kind of man. Thomas Aldridge was, by the standards of Caldwell County in 1901, the right kind of man. He was 31 years old, owned 80 acres of decent tobacco land outright, had no significant debts, kept a clean house, attended church without fail, and had a reputation for being steady and reliable in the way that men who are neither brilliant nor difficult tend to be steady and reliable. He was not exciting. He was not particularly handsome. But he was solvent and he was serious, and he had made it known through the appropriate channels of county social life that he was looking for a wife. Augusta Marsh had 3 conversations with Thomas Aldridge in the spring of 1901 before the question of which daughter he might be interested in was even formally raised. By the time it was raised, something had already gone wrong that Augusta was managing very carefully and very quietly. Cecelia Marsh was 23 years old in the spring of 1901 and was, by all accounts, a striking woman, tall, composed, with a directness in her manner that some people in Caldwell County found impressive and others found unsettling in a woman of her age. She had been engaged once before, to a man named Philip Courtney, who had broken the engagement in 1899 for reasons that were never fully explained publicly but were understood privately to have something to do with Cecilia's refusal to be managed in the ways that Philip Courtney felt a woman ought to be manageable. After that broken engagement, Cecelia had done something that was, for Caldwell County in 1900, genuinely unusual. She had written a letter to a cousin in Nashville and gone to work as a bookkeeper's assistant in that cousin's husband's business. She had been living in Nashville for just under a year when Thomas Aldridge began his conversations with Augusta Marsh about the possibility of a match. Augusta had written to Cecelia. Cecelia had written back. What those letters said is not fully known, but what is known, from a document that surfaced much later, which we will come to, is that Cecilia's response to the prospect of marrying Thomas Aldridge was a refusal so unambiguous that Augusta understood immediately there was no point in pursuing it. Cecelia was not coming back to Caldwell County to marry a tobacco farmer she had met twice, regardless of how solvent he was. She had a life in Nashville that she intended to keep, and she said so, in writing, to her mother. This left Augusta with a problem. Thomas Aldridge had made his interest known and was expecting an answer. The social machinery of the county was already in motion, and Cecelia, who was supposed to be the answer, had declined to be. It was at this point, according to the account that Vera herself gave decades later, that Augusta turned to her younger daughter. Vera Marsh was 20 years old in the spring of 1901. She was shorter than Cecelia, quieter, less striking in the way that younger siblings of forceful older siblings often seem quieter by comparison rather than by nature. She had grown up in her sister's shadow without particular resentment, had watched Cecilia's engagement and its dissolution with the careful attention of someone who is learning what not to do, and had formed her own views about Thomas Aldridge during the period when he was visiting the house. Her views were considerably warmer than Cecilia's. She found him steady in a way she valued rather than dull in a way she feared. She thought, when she allowed herself to think about it directly, that she could be content with a life built alongside Thomas Aldridge. The question was how to get there from where she was. In the social calculus of Caldwell County in 1901, Thomas had expressed interest in Cecelia, and Cecilia's refusal was an embarrassment that could not be entirely absorbed without cost. But Augusta, who was a practical woman, had identified what she believed was a solution. It required Cecilia's cooperation, and it required something of Vera that would shape every day of the next 40 years of her life. What Augusta proposed, in the account Vera later gave, was simple in its mechanics and staggering in its implications. Cecelia would return from Nashville for the wedding. The wedding would proceed as if Cecelia were the bride. Thomas Aldridge, who had met Cecelia twice and Vera not at all in any formal capacity, would be told that he was marrying Cecelia Marsh. After the wedding, Cecelia would return to Nashville and continue her life there. Vera would remain in Caldwell County as Cecelia Aldridge, and nobody, not Thomas, not the congregation, not anyone in the county, would be the wiser, because the Marsh sisters did not look dissimilar enough that a man who had met Cecelia twice in formal social settings would necessarily notice the difference in the context of a wedding where attention moves in many directions at once. It was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary thing to propose. And yet it happened. The question of why it happened, why Cecelia agreed, why Vera agreed, what Augusta said to each of them to make this the outcome, is the part of the story that took 40 years to answer, and even then was only partially answered, because the people who knew the most about it were dead or unwilling by the time anyone was asking the right questions. What we know is this. Cecelia agreed. She came back from Nashville for the ceremony, stood in the doorway of the church long enough to be seen arriving, and then made herself unavailable for the kind of close inspection that might have revealed the substitution, while Vera, wearing Cecilia's dress and carrying Cecilia's Bible and using Cecilia's name, walked down the aisle toward Thomas Aldridge and said vows that were legally and spiritually binding under a name that was not hers. Reverend Good, who had known the family for 30 years, did not notice. 63 witnesses did not notice. Thomas Aldridge did not notice. And the woman who became Cecelia Aldridge on that July afternoon in 1901 walked out of that church into a life she had chosen through means that she would spend the next 4 decades making sure no one ever examined too closely. This is Grimveil Epoch, where forgotten stories resurface. Subscribe, and like the video. Don't miss what rises next from the darkness. The first years of the marriage were, by all available accounts, genuinely functional. Thomas Aldridge was the man Vera had assessed him to be. Steady, undemanding, not given to the kind of scrutiny that might have created problems. He was attentive in a general way without being perceptive in a specific way, which is a distinction that matters enormously when you are living inside a deception that requires the people around you to not look too carefully at anything. He called his wife Cecelia. She answered to it. By the time their first child was born in 1903, a daughter they named Florence, the name Cecelia Aldridge had been on Vera's tongue long enough that she no longer had to think about using it. What she did have to think about, constantly and carefully, was the architecture of the lie. This was more complicated than it sounds, because Caldwell County was exactly the kind of place where the past and the present lived in the same room. People remembered things. People asked questions that were not intended as dangerous but were dangerous anyway. Questions about her time in Nashville, about what she had done there, about mutual acquaintances who might have known Cecelia but had never met Vera. Every conversation was a potential trap, not because anyone was looking for the truth, but because the truth was so close to the surface that an incautious word could bring it up without anyone intending to. Vera managed this through a combination of strategic vagueness and careful redirection that she became very skilled at over time. When asked about Nashville, she was pleasant and brief. When asked about specific people or events from Cecilia's time there, she had a repertoire of responses that deflected without lying directly. She had a tendency to misremember things. She said she had never been very good with names. Those years felt like a long time ago now. She kept her answers short and her manner warm, and she changed the subject with the practiced ease of someone who has had years of practice. Nobody in Caldwell County ever pressed her. Why would they? She was Cecelia Aldridge. They had watched her get married. The real Cecelia, meanwhile, had continued her life in Nashville with what the later account described as a mixture of relief and guilt that never fully resolved into either. She had used the cover of the wedding and her supposed removal to Caldwell County to quietly build a different kind of life. She had continued working, had eventually entered into a partnership of her own with a man named David Firth, who was a printer and who, unlike Thomas Aldridge, found Cecilia's directness more attractive than alarming. They were not formally married, which in Nashville in the early 1900s was not quite as difficult to manage as it would have been in Caldwell County, and they had 2 children of their own, children who grew up knowing their mother as Cecelia Firth and knowing nothing at all about Caldwell County or tobacco farming, or a sister who was living their mother's official life 30 miles away. The 2 sisters maintained contact. This is the part of the story that is most difficult to fully comprehend, that Vera and Cecelia, over the course of 40 years, wrote letters to each other, occasionally met when circumstances allowed, and maintained a relationship that was by all indications genuinely close, despite the fact that the foundation of that relationship was a deception of such scale that it had reordered both of their lives completely. What they wrote about in those letters is not entirely known, because most of them were destroyed, but a small number survived, found after Vera's death in a lockbox that her daughter Florence opened in 1943. And those letters reveal something important about how each woman understood what they had done. Cecilia's letters, and the ones that survived, never directly addressed the substitution. They discussed daily life, the children, small observations about the world, questions about Vera's health and the children's progress. They were warm without being confessional, affectionate without being specific about the thing that most needed to be spoken of directly. It is possible to read them as the letters of 2 sisters living ordinary separate lives. It is also possible to read them as the letters of 2 people who have agreed, without ever stating the agreement, to never speak about the thing they both know. Vera's letters, in the few that survived on Cecilia's side and were eventually traced, are different in tone. They are shorter, more careful, and occasionally contain passages of a precision that suggest Vera was writing things she could not say out loud to anyone else in her life. In one letter from 1921, 20 years into the marriage, Vera wrote a sentence that the person who eventually researched this story called the most honest thing in the entire archive. She wrote, "I have been here so long that I am no longer certain where she ends and I begin, and I am not sure that distinction matters to anyone except me, and some days I am not sure it matters to me either." That letter was written on a Tuesday in October. Thomas Aldridge died the following March, in 1922, of a heart condition that had been developing for several years. He never knew. Not once in 21 years of marriage did he know. The question of whether Thomas Aldridge ever suspected anything is one that cannot be definitively answered. The people who knew him well and were still alive when the story eventually surfaced were unanimous in saying that he was not a suspicious man by nature, that he took the world at face value in a way that was both his greatest strength and the quality that made the deception possible. His daughter Florence, who was 19 when her father died and who knew nothing of the substitution at the time, said in an interview conducted in 1945 that her father had been a man who believed what people told him because the alternative, believing that the world was full of people concealing things, was not a way he wanted to live. He chose, consciously or not, to see the surface. What was underneath the surface of his own marriage he never looked for. Vera, for 40 years, made sure he had no reason to. The story came apart in 1941, 40 years after the wedding, and it came apart not through any dramatic revelation or deliberate confession but through the particular cruelty of the administrative world, specifically through a government form. The Social Security Administration, which had been established in 1935 and was by 1941 in the process of catching up with its own record-keeping requirements, sent a routine inquiry to Cecelia Aldridge of Caldwell County, Tennessee, regarding a discrepancy in birth records associated with her Social Security enrollment. The discrepancy was minor, a clerical inconsistency between her stated birth date and the date on a census record from 1900. It was the kind of thing that happened frequently and was usually resolved with a simple document submission. But the document that was requested, a birth certificate, was one that Vera could not produce under the name Cecelia Marsh without the discrepancy becoming something much larger than a clerical inconsistency. Florence Aldridge, who was 38 years old in 1941 and had been managing her widowed mother's affairs for several years due to Vera's declining health, was the one who opened the letter. She was the one who went to her mother's room and sat on the edge of the bed and asked the question that she had. She later said, never had any reason to ask before that moment. She asked her mother what her real name was. What followed was a conversation that Florence described, in the 1945 interview, as the longest afternoon of her life. Vera, who was 60 years old and had been Cecelia Aldridge for 4 decades, told her daughter everything. She told her about the Nashville letter and Augusta's proposal, and the wedding and the dress and the Bible and the 63 witnesses who had not looked closely enough. She told her about the letters and the occasional meetings and the careful architecture of 40 years of managed truth. She told her about Thomas Aldridge, who had been a good husband and a good father and who had gone to his grave believing his wife was who she said she was. And she told Florence, with the particular directness of someone who has been careful for a very long time and has finally reached the point where care is no longer possible, that Florence's Aunt Cecelia was alive and living in Nashville and had 2 children of her own, and had known every day of Florence's life, that she was Florence's mother's true identity and had said nothing. Florence sat with this information for 3 days before she did anything with it. She told no one during those 3 days, went about her ordinary life in Caldwell County, attended a ladies' auxiliary meeting, made a pot roast, helped her youngest brother with a fence repair, and then on the 4th day she drove to Nashville. The meeting between Florence Aldridge and Cecelia Faith, Cecelia Marsh, the real Cecelia, the woman whose name and life Florence had been living inside without knowing it, is described in the 1945 interview with a restraint that suggests Florence was still not entirely sure how to characterize it 4 years later. She said that Cecelia had answered the door and had known immediately who Florence was, and had stepped back to let her in without saying anything for a long moment. She said that Cecelia had looked like her mother, which she found disorienting in a way she had not anticipated. She said that they had sat in Cecilia's kitchen for 4 hours, and that Cecelia had answered every question she asked with a directness that she found both admirable and, in some ways she couldn't fully articulate, infuriating. Cecelia did not apologize. She explained. She was precise and honest about every element of what had happened and why, including her own role in it, and she spoke about Vera with a tenderness that was genuine enough that Florence could not dismiss it, even through her anger. What Cecelia told Florence was this. She had agreed to the plan not because her mother had pressured her, though Augusta had tried. She had agreed because she understood, in a way she could not fully explain to a 20-year-old Vera in the spring of 1901, that Vera loved Thomas Aldridge and would be good for him in ways that Cecelia herself would not have been. She had seen it clearly, the way you sometimes see things clearly about other people that they cannot see about themselves. Vera wanted that life. Cecelia did not. And the obstacle between Vera and that life was the social machinery of Caldwell County, which had decided that the older sister should go first and would not easily accommodate a different arrangement. So they had found a way around the machinery. It was not a good way. It had costs that Cecelia acknowledged fully and without deflection. But it had worked, in the sense that Vera had lived a life she wanted and Thomas had had a wife who genuinely loved him, and Florence and her brothers had grown up in a home that was, whatever its foundation, a real home. Florence listened to all of this. Then she asked the question she had driven to Nashville to ask, the question underneath all the other questions. She asked whether her father had ever been given the chance to know, whether at any point in 21 years of marriage Thomas Aldridge had been offered the truth. Cecelia was quiet for a moment. Then she said that Vera had offered, once, in the early years, to tell him, that she had told Cecelia in a letter that she intended to tell him, that she could not continue without him knowing, that the weight of it was something she could not carry indefinitely, and that Cecelia had written back and told her not to, that the harm of telling would be greater than the harm of not telling. That some truths, once loose, could not be caught again. That the people who would suffer most from the telling were the people who deserved it least. Florence drove back to Caldwell County that evening. She sat with her mother for several hours. They did not speak much. Vera was tired in the way of someone who has put down a very heavy thing, and is not yet sure what it feels like to stand without it. Florence held her hand for a while in the late afternoon light coming through the bedroom window. At some point Vera said, "I was happy, Florence. Whatever else it was, I was genuinely happy." Florence did not answer that directly. What she said, eventually, was that she believed her. And she did. That was the part that was hardest to carry. Not the lie, not even the 40 years of it, but the fact that it had been built on something real. That the life inside the deception had been an actual life, with actual love in it, and that knowing the foundation did not make the structure dissipate. This is Grimveil Epoch, where forgotten stories resurface. Subscribe, and like the video. Don't miss what rises next from the darkness. Vera Marsh, who had been Cecelia Aldridge for 40 years, died in the spring of 1943. Her death certificate listed her name as Cecelia Aldridge. Her grave marker in the Caldwell County Cemetery reads the same. The Social Security discrepancy was resolved through a combination of documents and a carefully worded explanation that Florence and Cecelia worked out together, an explanation that was truthful in its individual components even if it did not explain the whole truth, and which the relevant administrative office accepted without further inquiry. The official record remained intact. Cecelia Aldridge had lived and died in Caldwell County, Tennessee, and the county's records reflected that completely. The real Cecelia Marsh outlived her sister by 9 years, dying in Nashville in 1952. She is buried there under the name Cecelia Firth. Her children and grandchildren knew her as Cecelia Firth. The Nashville life she had built was real and full and haze in every way that a life can be a person's own, and she had lived it with the particular intensity of someone who has chosen their freedom at a cost they are aware of every day. Florence Aldridge never told her brothers what she had learned. She made that decision alone, shortly after the conversation in Nashville, and she held to it for the rest of her long life. She decided that the knowledge would do her brothers no good and would cause them harm that served no purpose, and that the secret she was now carrying was the price of being the one who had opened the letter. She was not bitter about this, she said in the 1945 interview. She had come to understand it as a kind of inheritance, not the one she had expected, but real nonetheless. She had been given the truth. She had decided what to do with it. She lived with that decision the way her mother had lived with hers, carrying it carefully, making sure it did not become heavier than she could manage. The 1945 interview, which is the primary source for most of what is known about this story, was conducted by a woman named Margaret Ellison, who was a graduate student at Vanderbilt at the time, researching women's social histories in rural Tennessee. She found Florence through a chain of contacts that began with a reference librarian in Caldwell County and ended with a letter that Florence, by then 42 years old, chose to answer because she had decided it was time for someone outside the family to know what had happened. She did not ask Margaret Ellison not to publish what she learned. She simply told her the story and let her make her own decisions. Margaret Ellison completed her graduate work and went on to teach history at a small college in Georgia, and she never published the interview, for reasons she explained in a note she attached to the transcript before donating her papers to a Tennessee archive in 1978. The note said only that she had decided the story belonged to the people in it more than it belonged to the world, and that she would leave it to the archive to decide when the time was right to let it surface. The time, apparently, is now. There are things about this story that resist easy judgment. The deception was real and its costs were real. Thomas Aldridge was denied the most basic knowledge about the person he had married, and that denial was complete and permanent. He died without knowing. Whether knowing would have made his life better or worse is a question that cannot be answered, because the variables are too tangled and the man is too long gone. But the fact that he was never given the choice is not a small thing. It sits at the center of the story the way uncomfortable truths tend to sit. Not neatly, not resolvable, just present, requiring acknowledgement before anything else can be said. And yet, Vera Marsh loved Thomas Aldridge in a way that was genuine and demonstrated and sustained over 21 years of a real marriage. She raised 3 children with him and kept his house and sat beside him through illnesses and difficulties and the ordinary accumulated weight of a shared life. And she did all of it under a name that was not hers, with a consistency that is, whatever else it is, a form of commitment. The love was not a lie. That is the complicated thing. The love was entirely real, growing inside a container made of something false. And the realness of the love does not cancel the falseness of the container, and the falseness of the container does not cancel the realness of the love. And 40 years later, Florence is still sitting in a car on a Nashville street trying to figure out how to carry both of those things at the same time. What Cecelia built in Nashville was also real. She had taken the freedom that the arrangement gave her, the freedom that was the actual exchange at the center of this, Vera's life for Cecelia's liberty, and she had used it to make something. She had worked and loved and raised children and contributed to the world in the specific ways available to a woman of her time and her resources, and she had done it as herself, under her own name and spirit, if not entirely in letter, without the constraint of a life she had not chosen. The cost of that freedom was carried by other people. She knew that. She carried the knowledge of it every day. Whether the arithmetic of it adds up to something justifiable is not a question that has a clean answer. The Marsh sisters made a decision in the spring of 1901 that was shaped by the specific cruelties of the world they lived in, a world that gave women very few legitimate routes to the lives they wanted and expected them to accept whichever route was designated for them by the social machinery of their time and place. That context does not make what they did right, but it makes it comprehensible in a way that pure moral judgment tends to miss. They worked with what they had, in the way that people in constrained circumstances have always worked with what they had, and the life they constructed between them held for 40 years, which is longer than most things hold. Florence Aldridge lived to be 81 years old, dying in 1984 in Caldwell County, Tennessee, in the same county where her parents had married and her mother had been buried under the wrong name and her father had lived a good life without ever knowing the whole of it. She kept the letters her whole life, in the lockbox where she had found them, and she added to them over the years. Her own correspondence with Cecelia, later correspondence with Cecelia's children, a few photographs and documents that she felt belonged together. When she died, she left the box to a grandniece with a note that said simply, "Read this when you are old enough to understand that people are more complicated than their worst decisions and more than their best ones too, and that sometimes the most honest thing a person can do is hold a truth carefully until the right time to let it go. The right time, it turns out, is always later than you think and sooner than you're ready for." That is the other thing this story teaches, underneath everything else it teaches. The truth about the Marsh sisters and Thomas Aldridge and a white clapboard church in Caldwell County, Tennessee in the summer of 1901 waited for decades in a lockbox in a Tennessee archive and the careful memory of a woman who opened a letter and drove to Nashville and came back carrying something heavier than she had left with. It waited because the people who held it understood that timing matters, that a truth released at the wrong moment does damage, that the truth itself doesn't deserve and the people involved don't deserve either. And then, eventually, it surfaced, the way things that are buried long enough always do. Not with a crash, not with drama, but quietly, in the particular way of things that have been patient for a very long time and have finally decided that the wait is over.